Moving over to the defensive side of the ball, let's talk about the guys up front along that defensive line. They lose their leading sack getter from 2023 and second team Group of Five All American and Ben Kapinski to graduation, along with Joseph Anderson and Everett Rogers, who went to Houston. Not all is lost, as they do return Owen Ostrowski and talented freshman Von Troy Malone and others. What did Tulsa do to shore up that defensive line in the spring?
Yeah. Well, just like the tackle positions are a concern on offense, the defensive tackle positions are a concern on defense. I think they really like what they have at defensive end. Kapinski was fantastic last year, and you would have loved to have him for another year. He was such a team-first guy who had an incredible motor, almost never came off the field. He was fantastic. But I do love what they have at defensive end. That starts with Owen Ostrowski, who in roughly 8 games last year had about 10 tackles for loss. He was really good. When he was healthy, he was without question a starter. His dad was an All-American, Jerry Ostrowski, and then played 10 years in the NFL, offensive lineman. Owen is a kid who we all, if you cover high school football in this area, watched closely, knew how good he was, hated that TU was so late in offering him. And when they finally did, all of us said, thank you. Right. This kid deserves to play here, and he has done nothing but hit the ground running and prove that to be exactly right. Injuries have been an issue. It was multiple different minor injuries last year, and there was another one in the spring, I believe his thumb. He's got to stay healthy. If he stays healthy, he's going to be really good, have all the confidence in the world in him. Von Troy Malone is the guy with the most bend. That's sort of obvious the first time you watch these guys do any sort of pass rush drills. Really bright future. It did have, I think, more than 20 tackles last year and flashed some, but he's a breakout guy. I assume you'll ask me at some point about my defensive breakout guy. Von Troy Malone is definitely in the mix for that. Like I say, he's the guy coming off the edge with the bend that's sort of prototypical. But then, the third guy who you're pretty excited about coming off the edge is Miles Jackson, who was a transfer, I believe, from Indiana. Once again, one of those guys who was recruited, by a Big Ten school, and just watching him move around in the spring showcase, like you get it. So those 3 guys trying to get after the passer, like that's about as good as TU can hope for the most. In the 16 years I've been covering TU, like at that position, that's what you want it to look like. But defensive tackle is, I have no idea. There were guys who were injured in the spring, and so I think it was R.J. Jackson, who's an Oklahoma kid, and Ty Newhouse, who were starting in that spring showcase, but I don't necessarily know that they're the guys. Tyler Rich is a kid from Owasso, which is another area school, so we've seen him. Justin Lorenz is a guy who's been around a little bit, certainly flashed in the spring showcase. He wears number 94, and he again is a defensive end who can maybe come inside, but it's tough to say. That is a work in progress. They don't have ideal size or depth, but that's not to say that there aren't some guys who are promising, and it just didn't show itself necessarily in that spring showcase. And that said, they gave up a couple of long runs, but for the most part, the defensive line did a pretty good job in the practices I was able to see. The offense wasn't just picking up first downs left and right. They would make a play here or there. But for the most part, the defense probably, you could say, won the scrimmages that I saw. And obviously, you're not doing that if the guys in the middle of your defensive line aren't doing the job to some extent. And so I think that they have, a couple of guys that they feel have some real promise potentially. But the strength on the defensive line is definitely the guys who are rushing the passer. The beef in the middle is a little bit of a question mark for me.
The linebacking group was hit hard between graduation and the portal. They lost Julian Simon to UConn, Dorian Hopkins to UTEP, Mitchell Culkin, and Colton Smith to graduation. Those 4 accounted for about 22% of all the defensive tackles in 2023. What did Tulsa do to address those losses?
Well, transfers out, transfers in. They did a pretty good job landing a couple of local kids who actually played together and helped Broken Arrow. I've shouted out, I think, almost every big-time high school we've got here in the Tulsa area. And that's to Kevin Wilson's credit, because a lot of these kids were not recruited by Philip Montgomery, but they've been brought back in the fold via transfer by Kevin Wilson. And so Gavin Potter, who started his college career at Kansas and then Arkansas State for a year, he'll be in the mix at linebacker. Zach Marchicelli, who was at TCU, really liked the way he moves. Fluid athlete, got the start, if you want to call it that, in the spring showcase. I thought moved around pretty well. Elijah Wilson, a kid from Duncanville, redshirt freshman. He was alongside Marchicelli as sort of the other linebacking starter. And I like the way he moved and some of the plays he made. Chris Thompson Jr., who transfers in from USC, didn't flash a lot in the viewings that I had, but certainly a guy who, based on, having been recruited by Auburn and then USC, is a guy who I think certainly has the size, speed, talent that you want. So I think they're going to be okay. Eli McWilliams is another one of our local kids who forced a fumble in that spring showcase. Kind of a bigger kid who I think you could also see them playing a jack position and coming off the edge. So they've got enough bodies. And I don't think that the linebacker play was outstanding enough last year that's a huge concern. They've got several guys who have played at a higher level than the American Athletic Conference. And they weren't guys necessarily who were incredibly productive. You don't expect all of those guys to hit, but you expect a couple. And the way defenses play these days, really you almost never have more than two linebackers on the field anyway. And so I don't see depth as just a huge concern. If you felt like you had to play three linebackers down in, down out, I think getting to 6 or 7 that you felt good about might be a problem. But I don't think that getting to 4 or 5 that you feel pretty good about is going to be a problem.
So the defensive backfield loses a big-time contributor and leading tackler, Kendarin Ray, who counted for about 15% of all Tulsa tackles in 2023. They also lose Jace Oliver to TCU. However, they do return Dane Hodge and Tyree Carlisle, among others. How did the defensive backfield look in the spring?
Not bad. I would say that they played pretty conservatively. It seemed like they were blitzing linebackers a lot and then, trying to keep defensive backs, behind everything and not get beat deep. So a couple guys came up and made plays. One of them, DeMarco Jones, who is a Tulsa area kid who started his college career at Oklahoma State and came back. We didn't see him flash last year. To see him flash a couple times in the spring was nice. But the guys you feel really good about because they've played a fair amount and they've got kind of the either length or flat out speed that you want, Tyree Carlisle, Reggie Ellis, Kewan Parker. Those are guys who played a fair amount last year, who have played in the past, guys that I feel like, they trust. And then the guy that gets you excited is CJ Turner. We'll see if he's the guy who steps in and starts for Kendarin Ray at that particular safety position, or how long it'll take him to maybe become a leader there. But that was one of those guys who was about as highly recruited as TU is able to land out of Arkansas, I believe. And just watching him move around, like it's different. On the flip side of that, a guy who looks completely ordinary until he comes up and hits you and makes a play or two is Dane Hodge, a guy who made a lot of plays last year. And I don't know that there's anybody in the defensive backfield that they trust more than that guy. And he'll come up and play, kind of a rover, half linebacker type. He's a little guy, but he's got a nose for the ball. And without question, they trust him. So I think there's a nice mix of guys who have kind of top end athleticism for this level, TU, and that would be some of the Carlisle and Ellis and Turner. And then some guys who are just kind of gamers who you feel like you can count on. So that position is a work in progress too. I'm not going to tell you it's not. You don't lose Kendarin Ray. You don't lose Jace Oliver and just replace him like that. I am not saying that. But I think they feel like they have the bodies in place to get close. And especially in year 2 under Chris Polizzi, this defense should, on the whole, probably be better than it was last year. And maybe not to start the year. Maybe it takes a little while. But there's greater depth. And then obviously, I think greater trust in the coaching staff and understanding in what they're asking you to do. And those are probably things that are going to serve this defense well.
All right, Caden, you guessed it. I was going to ask you a little bit later. That time is now. If you had to pick a defensive player to have that breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
Yeah, I'll say Vontroy Malone, even though he did a pretty nice job, certainly in the amount of playing time he had last year. But you watch this kid just in drills. Doesn't take a rocket scientist. When a kid can come off the edge with that kind of bend, usually that translates. So I expect Malone to have a really nice year. I mentioned Turner in the backfield. And then any of those linebacker transfers, Marchicelli, Potter, Thompson Jr., wouldn't be surprised if any of those guys pop and become one of the better players on this defense. But I'll go Vontroy Malone. Excited to see him play.